Let us go back to the year 1735. At that time, Bengal had two ports. One was at Bhagwan and the other one was at Cossimbazar. My ancestors are Chattopadhyays by tradition, and they had been brought to Bengal by King Adishur in the medieval ages to perform the rituals, and they had settled in the area of Bhagwan, which was a port, and that was the center of business in those days, and it was a domestic port where the entire produce of food grains used to be exported from there, and people from Gujarat, from Maharashtra, from Bengal, from Europe, they used to travel all the way to Bhagwan and buy the food grains from there. My ancestors, Rajbari Roy and his forefathers, they used to reside at a beautiful village by the name of Pirojpur, which was on the banks of the river, and they had their business of exports of food grains and agricultural produce in Bhagwan. But what happened was that Murshidabad was very rich in those days, and it is written in the books of history that the riches of Murshidabad was far greater than the city of London because of this huge export and import business that used to happen through the ports of Bhagwan and Cossimbazar. And this is the news that travelled far away to the lands in Maharashtra, and the dacoits, who were known as Borgis, they travelled all the way on horsebacks to the forest, and they came and then they plundered the wealth of Bhagwan. And what happened was that they took away all the wealth, and it was economically devastated. But subsequently the Nawab of Murshidabad, he set up a huge army to resist in case there was another attack. But what happened? There was no further disturbance for the next 6 years, and the army became slack and lazy, and they became unprepared. And at this time, the second time, the Borgis from Maharashtra, again they came on the horsebacks, and this was second time a huge combing expedition which lasted for several months, and they ransacked the villages and houses of all the wealthy people on both sides of the river Bhagirathi, and they took away all the wealth, and they killed most of the people, and finally they set fire to the port of Bhagwan, and the port burned down forever. Most of the people were killed in this merciless expedition, but few survived, including my ancestor Rajbari Roy and his wife, and they lost their houses and buildings and Thakur Dalan and Pujo Dalan, and everything was scrapped and razed to the ground. And finally, with nothing in hand, they travelled to Cossimbazar, because that was an international port which before 1757 was visited by several European countries, the Dutch, the French, the Armenians, the British. Everybody sailed their ships from Europe over 3 centuries, and the ships used to dock in the port of Cossimbazar. The jetty was set up by the British people, and this was a huge international export center, and Murshidabad was famous for exporting indigo, spices, bell metal utensils, Murshidabad silk, and of course the most exquisite thing was the ivory carvings of Murshidabad. And this was the reason why the Europeans used to flock from the different countries and set their anchors in the port of Cossimbazar, and it was a very, very rich center of business. And my ancestors, Rajbari Roy and his family, they set up a small room with a veranda, and they started their family business once again of exporting silk, and that is how in the subsequent few generations they were able to re-establish their fortunes of the family, and slowly and steadily they started building this beautiful palace, which today is known as the Cossimbazar Palace of the Royals, the Royal Palace or the Rajbari as it is known today. And these beautiful structures and houses were built over 10 generations, and as you will understand or realize, this is not a single building but a various collection of buildings or a set of buildings that was built over 10 generations of the Royals. So this is in a nutshell the history of the Cossimbazar Royals families. Originally we were Chattopadhyayas, we are Brahmins, but during the Mughal times our ancestors, namely Rajbari Roy, he was a very learned person and he was a noble person, and to recognize his activities, the Nawab of that time, gave him the royal title of Rai, it's called as Rai, and he was recognized with a silver stick and a kilot, which means a royal cloak. So this was how a nobleman was recognized during the Mughal times, and he had the title of Rai bestowed upon him, which continues as the title of the family in place of Chattopadhyay. Everything went on fine. The trade and commerce, business, exports to Europe, silk exports were fine, and there were a lot of fortunes and good opportunities of business. But suddenly what happened? In 1757, disaster struck. What happened was that the Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah, he was defeated by the British, and then the British people, the East India Company, they started to rule our country. And by that time, Cossimbazar was a highly industrialized city where the Dutch had the factory producing Murshidabad silk, and they had employed 750 workers, the local workmen who were skilled to produce the finest of the Murshidabad silk. And to compete with them, the French people, they had also set up their factory producing Murshidabad silk, and also the English had their own factory. So three European nations, they were competing with each other producing Murshidabad silk, and this entire production used to be exported from here, and it was a huge activity. But what happened with the rule of the British, of the East India Company, when they came into power, they closed down all the factories in Cossimbazar, and they drove out the other European people from here. And the river, the Bhagirathi river, which used to flow all around the Cossimbazar city, almost like an oxbow lake. It was a huge meandering serpentine river that used to flow. That river, it overflowed its banks, and it is recorded in the history books that the flood was so much that it inundated the lands, the entire land from Cossimbazar to Bhagwan Gola, and it went underwater. So subsequently, the river changed its course, and the East India Company, they also put a gate to the water movement all around Cossimbazar, and the river became straight flowing, bypassing the land of Cossimbazar. And thereafter, the port of Cossimbazar was closed down for good. Trade and commerce industry, it completely collapsed. There was huge plagues and earthquakes, and so many devastating things happened. And from a thriving industrialized city that existed for almost 3 centuries, Cossimbazar turned into a small, poor village, almost forgotten in the lands of the forest. So this is what happened. And subsequently, the British rule came into power, and it was the British people who started ruling us for the next 200 years.